Hi, everybody. This is Jeremy with the Next Big Idea Club, and I'm here with Aaron Dignan. Aaron is the founder of The Ready, an organization design and transformation firm that helps institutions like Microsoft, Citibank, Airbnb, et cetera, change the way they work. And he's also the author of the Next Big Idea Club Spring finalist, Brave New Work. And we're here to talk about that this afternoon. So, Aaron, thank you for joining.
Oh, thanks for having me. Let's do it.
Of course. Yeah, let's do it, man. So to start off, I thought we could just go back to the very beginning. Tell me about how this book exactly came about.
Yeah, so I guess I've been working with organizations almost my entire career in different capacities. First, in kind of thinking about brands and the role they play in culture, and then thinking about digital technology and the role that plays in culture. And then most recently, thinking about the fact that the way we organize and come together is actually kind of at the root of all the, all the issues that we're facing and all the things that we need to be able to tackle in the decade to come. So that's been kind of the journey of my work. And over the last 4 or 5 years, been really heavily leaning into that with organizations of every shape and size in 15 countries across 5 continents, like lots of exposure. And the book felt like a chance to kind of capture that. So we don't have everything figured out. We're not, it's not a book full of answers. It's more full of, questions and things to try and consider. But it felt like a good moment to document what was going on in the world of work and help people think more carefully and more deliberately about the way they work and how that impacts their experience, their results, their communities, their very lives. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love how in the book you focus on this notion of bureaucracy and how there's often far too much of it. And in the book, you have this really astonishing anecdote about how the presence of bureaucracy often manifests in a way that almost looks like sabotage in our organizations nowadays. Tell us about that story, because it was just incredible when I read it for the first time.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It bounced around the internet a while ago. A few years back, maybe 5 years back, a particular guide was declassified that had to do with how to sabotage a company. It was written during World War II. What I like to do often when I'm talking to audiences is I'll just put the content of the Guide to Simple Sabotage on the screen, and it says things like, hold conferences when there's more important work to be done, and talk at great length, and use personal anecdotes, and have 3 people approve everything when 1 person would do, and all these ideas that for most of us who are in companies that are, older than 5 years and bigger than 500 people are like, yep, seen that. And so I start there, and then I ask if anybody knows where it's from, and sometimes a few people do, but most don't. And when we reveal that it's to a guide to how to sabotage a company that was written by effectively the precursor to the CIA during World War II, so it's 80 or 90 years old, people's minds are a little bit blown because they realize, and this is the message I try to bring home in the book, what was obviously sabotage, a human lifetime ago, is now just like indistinguishable from work. And that means that this idea of bureaucracy, which at its core just means that we have positional authority rather than authority in people that, like a king, and that we have a rule of law, that we have, policies and agreements, that, those are all very basic and good ideas, I think, but it has metastasized into something far more pernicious and pervasive, and there's red tape wrapped around every handle. And I think people are sensing that. So it's kind of cool to see the contrast between what was obviously sabotage to, our great grandparents and what is, very recognizable to us.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that story resonated with me immediately. And I think it's interesting how this kind of comes out at organizations, both large and small, which you kind of touch on in the book. Like I remember even back in college, I was on this like advisory board for the tour guides at our university. And it was a pretty small board. It was maybe like a dozen people at the most. And yet I still found that during so many meetings, we were just kind of spinning our wheels and not really doing anything of consequence. And I would kind of look around me, and I got the sense that I was the only one that was like that was sensing that. And maybe I wasn't, but it just felt like so many people were just kind of talking. And so what I loved about your book is that you pointed out that we just have so many meetings, more than we really need. And in fact, you actually recommend, in some cases, just trying a total cancellation period of like 2 weeks where there are no meeting
moratorium.
Right. Yeah. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think the point you make about size is a good one. Most people, I think, in the back of their heads think that large organizations are over here and small organizations are over there. And that's not how it works, right? People move in their lives and careers between all different sizes of organizations. And so when someone that's done something over here comes and starts something over there, they bring a lot of those mindsets and practices with them. And in fact, all of us who go through the public school system have gone through a machine designed to bureaucratize us, a machine designed to teach us to think a very particular way about problems and the world we live in and our role in it. And so like the idea that somehow, the big teams have the problems and the small teams don't, I think is an oversimplification. I think small teams generally suffer more from being on the chaos end of the spectrum where they don't have enough constraint. Large teams generally suffer from having too much constraint, but both are missing the right kind of constraint, enabling constraints that would allow them to self-manage and self-organize and kind of, uncover what they need to do. So I think that point is well taken. When it comes to meetings, I think meetings are just the microcosm of the organization, right? It's like you bring a team or a group of people together to do some work, and it sort of is a mirror for the broader thing, for what's going on at scale. And so whatever happens in meetings is probably happening across your whole organization. If it's wasted time, if it's lack of alignment, if it's lack of candor, if it's, whatever the case, whatever's happening there is happening at scale in far more ridiculous ways. So we like to think about meetings as a starting place sometimes for building new habits and new mindsets. And I think that most of the time, when we sit with teams, we see that they have so many meetings and so many meetings to prepare for meetings, because it's all part of the theater of, let me present the perfect work and get the approvals and get the reviews and get the feedback and the gold stars, and a lot of internal theater instead of actually customer focused or user focused work. So the meeting moratorium was just the idea that, one way to deal with that vast amount of meetings is just to stop and see what you miss, because the reality is that changing and tweaking each one in concert with everyone's participation, that's quite a massive undertaking. But just letting everyone agree that, like, yeah, for the next 2 or 3 weeks, we're not going to have any recurring meetings. Like, that's actually a really simple thing to execute. It's hard to agree to, but it's easy to execute. And then you get to find out what you miss. And the reality is, I'll bet anyone listening, watching, you won't miss a lot. Like, you'll miss a little bit of it, but you won't miss a lot of it. Right, and once you figure out what it is that you do miss, you can design much more deliberate, structured, facilitated, kind of team-owned meetings designed to get right at that stuff. So that's sort of the idea there.
Yeah, I love that. And one thing that really strikes me about that idea in particular is that if you're looking to make a positive change in your organization, I feel like the impulse is often to say, okay, what new thing can we do? What new policy can we enact or whatever. But in your book, you mentioned that a great place to start is actually to say, okay, well, what can we take away first, whether that's meetings or something else. So in these various organizations, when they start with that mentality of, okay, what can we do less of, or what can we take away? Besides meetings, is there anything else that people tend to cut back on with positive results?
Yeah, well, if you think about the organization, the things that we have a lot of are, we have a lot of roles and team structures and those sorts of things. We have a lot of policies or agreements or procedures or processes that are documented or not documented. And then, yeah, we have meetings and a couple other, trappings of the coordination need. I think all of those things are typically overwrought in a large or a more established company. So yeah, looking at, rather than saying, oh man, the travel policy isn't working for us, what should we replace it with? Again, the answer might be like, what if we didn't have a travel policy for a little while? What would happen? What would happen? And the reality is, maybe something bad would happen, but it's far more likely that the world would just stay almost exactly the way it is. And so then it's just one thing we don't have to write down or deal with or comply with. Or we would figure out what's actually missing. Like, what is the guidance that people need? And so I think removing constraint is a way of seeing what's really going on and seeing what emerges. And then you can interact with it from there. Generally speaking, we talk about complicated and complex systems in the book, and the idea that complicated systems are, linear causal cause and effect systems like a watch or an engine, and complex systems are things like traffic or the weather or a garden. And the metaphor matters because when you think about policy and procedure and structure and meetings, if you're gardening, then what you do is you kind of feed and starve You feed the things that you want to see happening, and you starve the things that don't. So you weed the things you don't want, and you give extra water and fertilizer to the things you do want, and you notice what happens when you interact with it, right? If I move this over here, does it grow better or does it grow worse? If I overwater this, does it like it or does it not like it? And so the work of tuning the organization is the work of sort of trying things, whether that be additive or removal, and then noticing, and then feeding or starving what happens next. So you're kind of in relationship with it. You're not going to fix it. You're just managing it.
Right, right. And in your experience and in your research, have you found an organization that you feel like exemplifies this really well, that is putting some of these policies into practice in a really effective manner?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, most of that research has been done by other people. I'm lucky to just draw from stories that we've heard, clients we've worked with, teams that we've met. But there is a pretty broad population now of companies thinking this way. The big case studies are folks like Buurtzorg in the Netherlands, which is a home nursing organization, or Haier in China, which is an appliance manufacturer, or Favi in France, which is a brass auto parts manufacturer, or Morningstar Tomato, which is on the west coast of the US. It's the world's largest tomato processor, or Gore-Tex, the makers of Gore-Tex, W.L. Gore, are pretty prominent in this space. Sometimes Spotify is mentioned in the same breath with some of these companies. And then there are so many others. I looked at about 70 for the book. There were at least 300 that I could easily find that I could choose from. And I think, based on what I've heard from Isaac Getz and other people in France, like the corporate liberation movement there has hundreds of companies in it just in France. So there's definitely something going on here. Semco down in Brazil for decades has been leading the way on this stuff. And it goes on and on. Yeah, there's plenty of folks. The thing they all have in common is that they are thinking about this continuous, participatory change, this continuous improvement of not just what we do, but how we do it and how we show up, for and with each other.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought up Morningstar in particular, because that story really struck me as unique. Would you mind taking us through exactly what they're doing over there?
Yeah. Morningstar has been an interesting one. They've been working differently for decades. Within the last maybe 7 years or so, they were profiled in an article by Gary Hamel, the professor and author. I think that was the first time people really got wind of what they were up to in a broader way, outside of the pockets of org nerds that I run with. And since then, they've gotten more and more coverage. But basically, when you work in tomato processing, you can imagine that's not the most glamorous thing in the world, but they really decided to take a very human-centered approach to the work. And so they have a self-proclaimed self-organizing environment where people are given a lot of autonomy and a lot of transparency and trust. Team members there, write their own job descriptions and set their own salaries using an advice process that allows their colleagues to, shape and provide feedback to what they're doing, but ultimately they have the final say to work on the things they want to work on and make what they want to make within reason. And it works really well. It's a company that has been remarkably profitable, in some cases 10x more profitable than their competitors over the last 20 years. So, and which, profit is one measure of success. It's certainly not the main one that I care about, but it is, it's the thing that the numbers jockeys care about. What I care about is the fact that, maybe people love to work there, and maybe they, feel connected to their community, and they feel like they're doing something that has meaning. That kind of stuff matters too. And I think they go actually hand in hand. You see that at places like Patagonia as well. when people feel connected to the work and the purpose and their membership at work, then the results tend to follow. So yeah. I think I'm really glad that that's true. If it wasn't true, that would make my job a lot harder.
For sure. But yeah, I still just can't believe that they're setting their own salaries and writing their own job titles. And it just strikes me that there's an incredible amount of trust that you need to place in your employees if you're a manager and you're setting those kind of policies. And you write in the book how a lot of the time the way that we organize our companies is a reflection of our assumptions about human nature. And so, so in your mind, what are those underlying assumptions about human nature that are currently sort of out in the workplace? And what are like the new assumptions or the new beliefs about human nature that you are trying to encourage?
Yeah. It's funny. I don't think much of it is new. I actually think it's just not well heard.
Mm.
I opened this book with a quote that has to do with like everything that needs to be said has already been said, but since nobody listened, let's say it all again. Which is
Oh,
how
I really like that. Yeah.
I felt like very little that I had to say in the book is like completely net new in the universe, but it's just all stuff that like, I can pull books off this shelf right here that are 30 years old that just nobody did what they said, and they're right. It's like, let's get with it. So I think that's a big part of it. But the work really goes back, I think, or at least a turning point in the work was the work of Douglas McGregor in the 60s, who was looking at attitudes about work and workers and trust and autonomy. And basically he had this idea of like theory X and theory Y. Theory X was this idea that people were basically untrustworthy and lazy and uncreative and needed to kind of be told what to do and needed to be put in line, and carrots and sticks and all this kind of stuff. And then theory Y was the idea that like, no, we kind of are wanting to self-actualize, and we want to learn, and we want responsibility, and we are creative under the right conditions, and just all has to do with like what's the environment that we're put in, and how do we kind of flourish to that. And his research and his thesis was sort of that theory X people don't actually exist. We're all theory Y by nature, but that because we believe there are theory X people, we build these elaborate cages for people that treat them a certain way, and then because we're chameleons, we start to show up that way. So if you treat me like a thief, I suddenly I have a dissonance with my own identity. I'm like, wait, am I a thief? And screw you, and I'm going to start to show up differently. And so when he would ask people, audiences, some of my colleagues in this industry still do this. You ask the audience, like, are you theory X or theory Y? Everybody says they're theory Y. You say, what about the people that work at your grocery store, your gas station, your car dealership, even your own colleagues in your own company, in that other department or that other function? And everybody's like, theory X. And like, they immediately go there. And so it's one of those things like the Lake Wobegon effect, where we can't all be above average. We can't all be theory Y, except everyone else is theory X, right? So so the idea is that, if you believe that, then you start to be suspect of a lot of the behaviorist, determinist kind of control and incentive driven approaches to work. And you start to think a lot more about what the environment is telling us. One of my favorite examples of this is just looking at like Sam's Club versus Costco. Both the exact same business, the exact same industry, but one group treats its workers differently, pays them differently, trusts them differently, et cetera. And you see the result. I mean, you see the result in the experience when you walk in, you see the result in the P&L, you see the result in what feels like the caliber of talent. And I think people, some people would argue like, oh no, one of them's getting the better people. And whenever we start talking about the better people or the good people or the top talent, I get more suspicious, because it's like, well, are they really? Or is it just that the environment is making people achieve more? It's making them realize what they're capable of and show up differently. So that's what's going on there. And I think those ideas are old. I mean, they're like, ancient Greece old, to talk about like what is the nature of human motivation and the nature of the kind of human desire for mastery and autonomy and purpose and all that kind of stuff, versus are we the economic man who just makes like the hyper rational decision in our best interest monetarily, which doesn't exist at all, but like all of our economics is built on it. So I think that's the reality. And people like, Danny Kahneman and others have like broken that wall a little bit in the last decade, where people are now realizing we have biases and we have non-rational ways of making decisions, and our emotional brain is deciding things before we do and all that stuff. But it hasn't really come into play in mainstream work. It's just sort of this like thing that we know over there. And then back to work, it's like, all right, annual bonuses and performance plans and performance management and, all that kind of stuff. So I think we're still missing a chance to integrate what we actually know, what the science tells us, and what our sort of wisdom traditions tell us, with how we actually show up at work and how we design work.
Right. And what I really appreciate about that is that you're really trying to bring this sense of like human dignity back into the picture, as opposed to just kind of treating people like, yeah, I know, imagine that. And it's funny, what that makes me think of is this story by Franz Kafka called The Trial. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah.
I was an English major back in college, so I had to bring this up because to the extent that you're talking about bureaucracy as this thing that can kind of stifle human creativity and stifle human flourishing. Here's this story for anybody that may not be familiar about this man who wakes up one morning and there are a couple of men in his house and they say, "Hey, you're under arrest." And he's like, "For what?" And they just won't tell him. But they say, "Hey, you need to show up at the court at this particular day, at this particular time, and get things sorted out." And so he does. But even then, the judge won't really be straight with him about what he did wrong. And so he kind of bounces around to all these different like lawyers and judges and other like, judicial, members of the local judiciary. And he can never figure out what the heck is going on because he's just lost in this maze of bureaucracy. And so I'm just wondering, when it comes to the ideas in your book, in your mind, do those apply to like the government or our legal system, or is it really just for business?
Yeah. It's funny you bring that story up because it was actually in the first draft of the book.
No kidding.
It got cut, so no one will know that big. But I thought that was really powerful. There's some other very kind of old short stories that are in that same ilk that I found when I was digging into like Max Weber and the origins of bureaucracy. So that's a cool rabbit hole to go down for the very nerdy among us, I guess. But I do think what I'm writing about just has to do with how human beings come together to solve problems and create new things. And so it doesn't have anything to do with like, it's only for profit or nonprofit or government or educational systems or whatever. I think, you put 10 people in a room, you get them to try to go do something. We're talking about the way we work together. And so I think government is squarely in that space. And I think, in many ways, government is one of the places where bureaucracy and dysfunctional teaming is most pronounced right now. We're seeing massive polarization. We're seeing immobilization and inability to get anything done. I mean, the legislators of our generation have passed far fewer, laws, changes, programs than their, predecessors. And it's all because we're stuck. We're stuck in this weird, system, corrupt system, I think, of its own design. And it's not that, the core tenets of democracy are wrong. It's just that the way we work matters, and the way we design these systems matters, and little changes affect things in massive ways. I think it's a really good case study, actually, of how important little choices in the operating system are. And if you suddenly decide that corporations are people, that things go a certain way. It's like it's one small choice, but it really it plays out over many decades. So I do think a lot about that, and I know there are some cases globally and even domestically of smaller municipalities starting to govern differently using ideas of consent rather than voting or consensus or autocracy or some of the other things that are inherently tyrannical. And I think that's encouraging, but I think we have a hugely long way to go. And I have decided personally to work on the business side of the equation because I know the leverage that businesses present both in culture and in government. And my thesis is if we can get organizations to work differently, inherently and naturally, the government will work differently, but the other way around might be harder.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like, another great way that this can manifest at the workplace is having a little bit more free time. Like you mentioned in the book, how Google in particular did a really incredible job of this, and the results kind of spoke for themselves. So could you tell us a little bit about what that looks like for Google employees and what ended up happening?
Yeah, I think the core principle is one of, voting with your feet. Like, what happens when people decide what they work on, right? Instead of being told what to work on. And I think it's a really provocative question because, on the one hand, someone can argue like people don't know what to work on. We have to tell them what to do. And if we don't tell everybody what to work on, nobody will clean the toilet, right? Like all the stuff that needs to get done won't get done. And I think that assumes very little of us. It assumes that we're unable to coordinate, that we're unable to share something in the commons and keep something healthy. And we know better. There's Nobel Prize winning work on maintaining the commons that shows that when the right constraints are in place, we can maintain a community garden. We can maintain, an office fridge. Like it is possible, but it's not possible without the right constraints and without the right agreements as a community. And so we need that, we need that connection. And so I think that commitment to the right constraints is the missing piece for what we can do. And if we can just agree on what those are and then come together, then all these other things are possible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I really like that. And I feel like it creates space for creativity and for innovation within organizations as well, right?
Yeah.
I remember reading that, in the case of Google, by giving their employees some of that freedom to pursue
20% time.
Right, the 20% time, exactly. You know, that they ended up with products like Gmail and Google Maps, like all those things emerged from that free time. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. And then interestingly, they shut the program down, or at least they talk about it less and support it less frequently. Like it's not as present in the culture as it used to be, because as it's
Huh.
scaled, it's, I think it's challenging um, to manage a system like that or to make sense of it. And I think 20% time is an interesting number because you have to figure out, well, when does that happen? Does that happen on Fridays? Does that happen at the end of every day? So the
Mhm.
coordination, I think at some level, they still support it in theory and perhaps in practice. But just in terms of, is everybody doing it? Is everybody taking it? I think the answers have come down. The percentage has come down since then. Interestingly, some of the other cases in the book that we look at take a much more radical stance, which is like, why 20% time? Why not 40? Why not 60? Why not 100% time? Right? Why not
Wow.
just let people that we trust that are professional adults decide what to work on? And I
Yeah.
think that is, that's the ultimate expression of the idea, which is
Mhm.
if we put a bunch of people together and we give them a shared purpose, or they choose a shared purpose or choose into it, and then we, understand the nature of what work has to get done, why can't they just coordinate and figure out how to get that work done? And what happens if
Mhm.
they don't? And I think one of the misunderstandings about self-management and self-organizing systems is that people assume that if there's going to be a failure, then by definition that approach is wrong, right? So
Mhm.
like, let's say that we don't, oh my God, we forgot to clean the toilet for 2 weeks. What would happen, right? Well, if we got to
Right.
empty the fridge, what would happen? And the reality is, like, what would happen is an immune system response would start to kick in. And that's where the learning happens, and that's where the mastery happens. So anybody
Mhm.
who's ever raised a child will tell you, you can't prevent them from ever skinning their knee, or they
Yeah.
will never learn how to run. Like, they won't be able to do anything on their own. They become completely codependent and messed up, right?
Mhm.
As adults,
Mhm.
you have to give them enough leash to make mistakes and to learn.
Mhm.
And you don't let them do anything that's catastrophic, right? You eliminate, you focus on what's safe to try. So there's no jumping off buildings, but there's lots of jumping off the couch. And the idea
Mhm.
is with these systems with 20% time, 100% time, or removing a policy or adding a policy, um, even if it's likely to create a problem or a fault down the road, that's not necessarily a bug. That's a feature.
Mhm.
The feature
Mhm.
is nobody cleaned the toilet for 2 weeks, and now we all have to sit in a room and be like, how the hell are we going to get this done? Because nobody's doing it for us. And then we decide it's a rotation, it's an election, it's a tour of duty, we're going to hire an outside firm that will just pay some of our fun money to clean the
Right.
toilet. And I use that as a silly example, but there's lots of real ones too, like uptime and customer service and all these other things. So I think that systems will, if they have enough autonomy, transparency, and purpose, um, they will solve these problems. They just might need to fail a little bit along the way, and that's okay.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, to me, that speaks to this whole concept of anti-fragility, right?
Yeah,
Where it's like, these systems, not only is it okay if they slip up from time to time, but
they get
actually,
stronger.
yeah, exactly. It makes them stronger over time, as long as you just give them that freedom and a little bit of leash to make a mistake every now and then learn from it.
Yeah,
So that makes
that's
a lot
right.
of sense. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, the idea that like your job as a leader or a founder is to ensure perfect execution, I think is incorrect.
Mm,
Your job as a leader is to ensure continually expanding capability.
mm,
And that means you have a totally different playbook, right? Like you're not in the business of preventing those errors. You're in the business of making sure we learn from those errors.
yes, I
And
love that.
and so it's a whole different game.
No, that's great, because once again, it sort of it brings the human dignity back into the equation. It's not saying, hey, I expect you to be this robot that gets it right every time. You're
Because we have robots and they're coming for those jobs. So we don't have to
yeah.
worry about that. Like the robots will do everything that conforms to a checklist. Don't worry about that.
Right, right, exactly. But as long as it's human beings, I think it's a good thing to recognize them as such.
Yeah. We've
Uh,
spent the last century treating human beings as robots because we had shitty robots. But now we have
mm,
robots. So, and we have
yeah.
automation and we have the emerging category of AI, even if it's not real AI, we at least have machine learning. So I think like those things are all going to let us put that work where it belongs. And then what's left is creative and emergent and problem solving and systems
Mhm.
thinking and all that stuff that's not going to conform well to do this perfectly.
Right.
Like launch a perfect software product. Nope, not going to
Yeah.
happen. Like forget it.
Right. Yep.
And I
Yep.
think that's people conflate the two. The idea that like coding software is a complicated activity that can be, made better with a checklist and with expertise. Where you can say like, yeah, this is well-written code. This is robust code. Creating software is a complex activity that people want to use, right? Software that people want to use, that's complex. So that means it's going to be massive amounts of feedback loops and learning and thrashing, and it's a totally different thing. Same activity connected at the center, but like two completely different systems. And so we don't get to pick. We have to do both. So it's just, it's about raising the level of deliberateness and awareness in the work.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I think we got time for maybe one more question, if that's okay.
Right, bonus question.
All right, bonus question. That's right. So for everybody watching this right now, I was just wondering if you could give them one piece of advice to take back into their offices later today. Maybe they're a manager, maybe they're not, but they're still passionate about getting their organization on track in a really humane and productive way. What would be that one piece of advice that you would give?
Yeah, it's pretty simple, and it's what I spend most of the third part of the book talking about. And it's, it's the question that's in the inside flap of the book, right? So you just open it up and it says, what's stopping you from doing the best work of your life? And I think that that's what I recommend people take back. Go back to a team, whether you're the leader of the team or not, go back to a team and ask everybody, can we spend 10 minutes talking about what's stopping us from doing the best work of our lives? And can we look at that list and can we pick one thing that we're willing to try and experiment on in the next week that might move us forward? Not solve it, not make it perfect, because none of that's possible, but just like, is there one thing where it'd be like, this thing's driving us crazy. Is there something we could try in the next week or two that would move us forward? Are we all willing to try it? Yes, cool. Let's go do it. It's as simple as that. And the reality is, like, you do that once or twice, you see that it's not, it's not intractable. It's not something that you have to spend the entire weekend on. It's a thing we can take small and immediate steps toward. And I think that starts to unlock bigger questions. It starts to make us more comfortable with some of the principles that actually serve us, like autonomy and transparency and consent and decentralization and trust and all that. By doing, like, learn by doing. If you want to change the organization, change it by changing it. It's not going to happen in a PowerPoint org chart, right? It's going to happen in a conversation. So, get into that conversation with just that one question, see what happens, and then, rinse and repeat.
I love it. All right. Well, Aaron Dignan, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.